Right, let me start by saying that I rarely do this. My brother got me to do this. I think the nature of our work is we don't come out publicly to do that. We are fixers. I think what it's a field that very few people know about. We assist political parties and candidates to win elections. And whenever I talk to people who know what I do, they say, "Do you rig elections?" And I say, "No, we don't rig elections." But over the years, we have been able to grow skills that help us, whoever we are working with, to gain a competitive edge over whoever they are running an election against. So my day job is political parties and candidates hire us. And when they hire us, we develop a strategy. We use data to win elections. This is what we do on a day-to-day basis. And it is a pleasure for me to be here. And I think my brother colluding with a colleague, with his colleagues, he felt that it's important for me to be here. And I think one of the major reasons why they also wanted me to be here is that this year we came up with an idea that we launched in Cape Town. There are expos that are run on a number of issues across the world. There's the Wedding Expo, there's the Sexpo. But we noticed that with the number of elections that are run globally, there is no political campaign expo. With the centrality of political campaigns in the public life, where decisions, where leaders come from political campaigns, there's very little investment on it. So for the first time globally, we launched what is called the Political Campaign Expo. We ran it for the first time in Cape Town. It's going to be a yearly event. We're going to take it across the world. Next year, we're going to hold it at the same venue. And the theme of this first expo was to look at the role of artificial intelligence in political campaigns. And I think that is the motivation, and that's the reason why I was invited here today to give my thoughts on it. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but I am going to speak to it. So you can follow it, but I want to make my presentation more conversational. For us in political campaigns, journalists or the media is central to political campaigns. I always argue that the most dangerous component in an election is an uninformed voter. If I had it my way, a voter who is uninformed should not be allowed to vote. And this is premised on an assumption that voting is rational. But in the work that we do, we don't believe that voting is rational. Voting is emotional. So in the strategies that we formulate what we call emotive campaigns that are anchored on the data that would have generated in how we run political campaigns. So what am I going to basically do today in this discussion? I'm going to try and provide my understanding of how the media and journalism interfaces with political campaigns. I'm also going to bring in the centrality of a citizen. How does a citizen process information, and how does AI play a critical role in that? So this is how I'm going to look at it. And some of the information might not be on the PowerPoint. It's what what the spirit leads. I'm a son of a pastor. So whenever I used to ask my late dad to say, how did you come up with that? He says, you know what, in some instances, the sermon is driven by what the spirit leads, and I proceed accordingly. So I explained earlier on that so key and critical components in political campaigns are when politicians start now to campaign, and this is something that we need to deal with. Campaigning has become ritualistic. So whenever there is now an election, you are definitely going to see the following. You are going to see placards. You are going to see billboards. You are going to see jingles. All these rituals are done every time you're going to see rallies. But at the center of it is that very rarely do political parties question themselves in terms of the utility and value of these things to a voter. A voter has evolved. If you look at data across the African continent and even globally, the participation of citizens in public life has gone down. If I give you an example of South Africa here, you've got a population of 62 million people. You should ideally have 42 million registered voters. But when the voters roll, you had 27 million who are registered. You had 16 million people who participated in the last election. If you look at the pattern from 1994, you can tell that is going to go down. If you're going to look at it in 2026, the local government election, it's going to go further down. My view is we have the larger number of citizens who ideally should participate in election, but they are not. If the people who don't vote would be on the ballot, they would win an election against those who go out and vote. So meaning that in most countries, we have got minority governments who are securing a minority mandate from citizens because a large number of citizens are not going out to vote. I always push to say the questions that journalists are not asking or the media is not asking, it's not about who won this election in South Africa today. It's about why did the majority of voters not participate? And what is it about them that they are saying? In my world, not participating in an election is actually a statement. So in a country, if the large majority of people don't participate, from a security level, it heightens the levels of insecurity. If you're in business, you should be worried because it's a sign that the country is unstable. When those people choose at some point for them to be able to express their voice, how do you think they're going to channel it? In political science, there's a theory of exit and voice by Manco Elson. It says that, it argues the following. When citizens are not happy with how they are governed, they exit. They exit from all opportunities of public life. They just say, we are no longer caring about this. And what are some of the tangibles? Those who can afford, they start looking for alternative sources of energy, alternative sources of water. They start building there. If you want to see an example of countries where citizens are able to formulate methods of exiting, go and look at Nigeria, go and look at Zimbabwe, go and look at most of the countries that have had challenges in terms of how they are governed. So the idea of artificial intelligence now is maybe it is an opportunity for us to be able to ensure that we encourage citizens to participate. But here lies the critical issue. Participating in election is a contact sport where you need to see the candidates, you want to hear what they say. How then does a citizen feel when we are now using machines? When machines are now the ones that are messaging? When we can now generate a poster using machine? When I can now be able to come up with a jingle, or I can be able to manipulate voice, image, and text? Does it increase the participation of a citizen, or it further reduces? Does it make our politics highly impersonal? These are critical questions that we need to grapple with. If you ask me in my private work, it's an opportunity. It basically means that if I get a ruling party client who I'm working with, and they've got large sums of money, it's problematic. But the reality of it, if they've got money, we will resource the campaign and use these tools. The questions that come in for you is, how free and fair is an election like that, where you have competitors of those with money and those without? It means that in an era of AI, opposition parties face a critical challenge. I piloted in one of the West African countries last year use of AI for the first time using image and voice. The cost of us to send 2.4 million messages 2 days before an election, it was $5 million. And that process gave a competitive edge to our client. Because whereas people generally use text messages, I see them here in South Africa, will you vote for me and everything. We had a tool that would say, you click on it, there's the voice of the candidate, there's the image. Hi, John. Very good morning to you. I think by now you have decided who you are going to vote for. Please vote for me. The same application goes to Belinda. It greets her like that. So if you look at the level of sophistication, it's enabling a candidate at one spot to reach out to multiple audiences and be able to campaign. It's not a fair tool, because the reality of it is that other opposition political parties or people who can't afford cannot be able to do that. But from where I'm coming from, it provides an opportunity. Now think about it in the context of misinformation and disinformation. So if you've got a tool like that in the hands of an irresponsible campaign firm or an irresponsible political party, look at the damage and the impact that it's likely to have in a campaign. I'm going to take you a bit into how disinformation plays out in an election. When we are running political campaigns, we work on two assumptions. We gain our vote from our supporters and undecided people. We don't care about those who belong to other parties. So the reality of it is that the game will be changed by the undecided and getting out those who are ordinarily our supporters to go out and vote. The challenge that happens now in an election is that there can be baseless claims on policy that might be shared on the platforms. There can be issues of character assassination and integrity that are peddled. People can move in deep fake and endorsements by other candidates. And the whole idea of this is we want to suppress voters. Currently, with the data that we sit with, the age between the 18 and 24 in political campaigns, we don't rely on that across Africa. When we are campaigning, we don't rely on that age group because, one, they don't go out and vote. Two, even if they are registered on the voting day, they will not be an audience that we deal with. So despite the youth bulge, the 18 to 24 group is an unreliable constituency when it comes to campaigns. And I want to debunk this notion. So there's a thinking across Africa that if you come up with tools, you get them, they will not go and vote. And very rarely do we waste our time on that audience. So now then, with this context of voter suppression, the challenge is an AI tool can be used to suppress citizen participation. And that's a critical component that we need to look at. How then do we deal with disinformation? We have a reality of a digital divide. Countries are different. South Africa is good infrastructure-wise, mobile penetration. It's not the same across the African continent. There are countries where the infrastructure is difficult and doesn't penetrate enough for everyone to have access to these digital items. Second, we have countries on the African continent which are very undemocratic, and therefore the infrastructure in terms of ensuring that there is fairness in communicating is only in favored or slanted in advantage of the ruling party. The third aspect I mentioned earlier on of resources. So in most instances, countering disinformation becomes a challenge. If a video is already gone out, who then has the responsibility to say this is inappropriate? Because once someone has received it via WhatsApp, Our civil society don't have that capacity. They don't have the resources to do that. I know you might recall earlier on last year, the big tech companies came up with a regulation charter and the document of intent in terms of what they were likely to do. And I didn't see anyone challenging it in academia and civil society. How do you think that someone who is there to make profit can self-regulate? How do you think they can do the job on your behalf? Why do you assume that they'll diligently do that? They're in business. The second problem, they are self-regulating and they're committing to doing that. Does civil society have the expertise to understand what is happening and whether they are maintaining their commitment? And therefore, the area of disinformation largely remains a challenge because of a number of factors that are there. As it is right now with the advent of AI, how many countries have come up with legislation and policy? I'm happy to see the SANEF director here. We need to be able to come up with frameworks, with policies, with mechanisms. We need to be able to retool and skill our media for them to be able to appreciate and understand, because they are playing a central role in between a voter and their decision. It's critical that we need to up the game. Issues of early detection of what happens. So if you look at, it's even difficult for me working on campaigns to quickly be able to see whether something is fake or is genuine. I know there's a proposition in other countries of watermarking stuff and all that. But in a political campaign, a lot of information is churned out. There is a partner organization that we work with in London that have come up with an algorithm for them to be able to detect disinformation. And they have come up with a method of ensuring that they can put it on major platforms so that at least if anything is fake, it's not peddled to a large extent. I don't know the extent in which it can be able to have an impact. They're testing it today in London, in the UK. We're going to see if it has had such a huge impact, but it's an attempt for them to try and deal with disinformation. And when you're looking at some of these factors that have to do with disinformation, some of it has to do with having individual bodies that are seated there, being able to work on it on a day-to-day basis. And I think some of this thing has to do with the resources. And so this conversation at a university is very, very important. And a project of this nature is needed at a university because the threat for political campaigns, elections, and decision-making lies in disinformation. And we need to be able to find mechanisms of addressing it. From where I'm seated, where I want to win an election, we don't peddle disinformation, but the reality of it is that it's not an area of interest for me. I have a separate agenda in terms of what I'm looking at. So someone else who is objective enough, who is not looking for money to be paid for winning an election, should take that responsibility of ensuring that they counter disinformation. So what then does it mean in terms of enhancing citizen engagement? I'll skip that slide. So I think it's important, particularly, and I'm going to offer suggestions in terms of what needs to happen. I think from where I'm seated, I think it's important for us to understand and place more value in our media and journalists, that they are not only there to share information. I think there is now a more additional responsibility for them to grapple with the advent of technology like AI, for them to be able to ensure that what goes out to a citizen is correct information. If you go out there and ask how citizens made their choices, I was watching the SA election, and one of the things that I really saw was a discussion in terms of what are the policy options of the different political parties. If there's anything that came out of the SA elections, there are four things that still need to be studied, and I'm hoping someone is doing research on that. Number one, you can win an election without a manifesto. You can win an election using structures of an old party. That's number one example, and it needs to be tested. Number two, you can have all the money, put up posters everywhere and run a sleek campaign, but that does not translate into voters. That is point number two that we need to look at. Point number three that we need to be able to explore is, as parties have receding support, the three major parties that receding support, the ANC, the DA, and the EFF, had receding support in the previous election. But that receding support is out of the core constituents that ordinarily voted for them. We did not have new voters coming in. When the voter registration was completed towards the tail end of the election, we had 1.5 million people registering. But when I was looking at the data, that 1.5 million people who registered, they also did not even turn up at the election. We need to be able to look at that. So in a context like that, we need to be able to understand what is it. AI wasn't used a lot in this election. I know the IEC was using AI in terms of being able to assess and track some of these things, but political parties didn't use it as a tool. The political parties here, they remained glued with their old tactics, door-to-door posters and billboards. And maybe it might be time that we do away with that. But if there's anything that I am sure about, is that the South African voter is not happy with what is on the table. They're still looking for an option. And this is what happens across the continent. What are some of the case studies that we can look at? And this is something that you can look at in terms of where there's been high usage of AI. Kenya, there's been a high usage of AI. When you look at the next elections that are coming in, we're going to have a large number, because Kenya generally has a tendency of piloting new tools. And it's one area that they've used in terms of increasing awareness. Nigeria ordinarily also does that. So, in winding down, what do we take from what I've just been trying to discuss with you? In winding down, my issue that I'm putting on the table is that AI offers an opportunity, but an opportunity that is limited because of the level of internet penetration, infrastructure, and digital divide in different countries. Number two, AI can only go so far in terms of its impact if there is an understanding of how we can be able to manage and regulate its impact. And the political parties are not going to do that. Candidates are not going to do that. The problem lies with the media, whose role is to inform, for them to play a critical role. Number three, we need to invest in tooling and skilling our media. If there's curriculum that is being taught in media school, I have a political science background, they need to really look into it. So the media space is not dead. The reality of it is that it has to up its game. We cannot say because everyone is now a journalist, they can send information through their WhatsApp, then we slide back and say it's not playing. There's no need for that. We actually need to up our game in terms of the skills that we are providing to the media. Right. What are some of the strategies that we can use for implementing this? There's need for collaboration. And the most powerful stakeholder that we need to deal with is our tech companies. But tech companies are very, very vested in their agenda of making profit. So the reality of it is that for you to be able to run this project, you need funding. If a tech company gives you funding to run a project of this nature, how much can you be able? The power dynamics between the funder and you receiving the resources becomes a problem. We need to provide capacity building, which I've mentioned, and we need to deal with issues of accountability. This is what can be able to assist us in it. So from a corporate social responsibility, what are we doing in the space that I'm working? We've decided that for us to be able to at least improve the quality in terms of how we are campaigning, we are going to run the International Political Campaign Expo every year. And this is just to improve the quality of political campaigning. We are inviting all the stakeholders to be able to come to it. The media has to come. It's an opportunity for you to get skills or tools from your other colleagues. Political parties, independent electoral commissions should come there. It is a platform for sharing of information. And so feel free to come in when we hold it in 2025 on the 23rd and 24th of January in Cape Town. Last year, we had 150 participants who attended from 20 countries. We partnered with Afrobarometer because they are data organization. We also worked with International IDEA because we wanted to draw in election management bodies. And 2025, our theme is Unlocking Voting Potential, the art of resourcing and skilling for winning campaigns. And we're expecting 500 participants to converge in Cape Town. And one area that we want to improve is exhibitors. People who are providing any tool and aspect that is to do with political campaigns. We want them to attend. And the 2025 Expo is going to focus on 5 areas. We're going to focus on the role of political campaigns in mobilization, political campaigns and communication, the role of money in political campaigns. We're going to focus on logistics. It's a critical component that we need to deal with. And what it relates to is we're going to focus on communication. And I think in those 2 days, we're going to have media experts sharing what are some of the latest tools, what are some of the latest ideas, because we believe on the centrality and the importance of running quality, effective, and informative political campaigns. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate it.
Any sort of idea, and feel free just to shout out, how many countries in Africa actually has some form of a policy or strategy around AI? Any guesses? So we're sitting with 9. We have 1 country that has a policy, and we have 8 that have strategies in place already. And we have 15 that are currently in formulation of some form of a policy or strategy. Now, that in itself is telling us that Africa is quite aware of the impact of AI, 1. 2, it's also telling us that they're quite embracing the technology on a few fronts. So, with that, I think let's start with the definitions of AI, because I think that's a good place. Everyone has different ideas of how to define AI, and that kind of is the basis of how policies are actually then formulated, right? So we have the likes of the US, who deem AI as something that is very much similar to a human, anything that mimics human intelligence. Then we have China, which says that it is not only just very much human, but it's human from a very cognitive perspective, right? And then you have the EU, which says that AI is defined as behavior, okay? So all very, very different approaches. And then when you delve into Africa, you have some that have mimicked the likes of either China or US in terms of their definitions. But then we also kind of see very much in terms of others that define it as a field of study, which I found very interesting. So we're not saying that it's anything that's attached to mimicking human-like behavior. Neither are we saying that it is anything to do with, the intelligence. We're saying that it's just a field of study. Now, I don't know whether that's us being too conservative as a continent in terms of how we're defining it and what exactly we want to take from it. So in terms of the breakdown, there's been various different entities that have defined or wanted to contribute to how AI is formulated from an Africa perspective. So if we start with the African Union, to whom... Perfect. So if we had to go from an African Union perspective, who I sort of represent as an advisor. I also sit as an advisor to some of the ministers of ICT across the continent, besides a few other hats that I wear. So, you know, in 2018, the AU came out with a strategy that literally helped to guide all of where AI is or will be implemented and how that would be shaped. Okay, so we have things around them just trying to create basic awareness and basic guidelines in terms of us having to, you know, really just say, hey, there's the technology, let's start playing around with it. So from that period of time to last year, 2023, there's been a different approach from the AU, which has literally been, okay, how can we now position Africa as being someone within the forefront, someone that is now also taking into account, you know, ethical considerations, the African Union. So they would go into any particular country or member states and help them to then support the implementation of any of those policies. So where do they stand with this? They stand in terms of saying that let's define sustainable development, okay, because that is their sort of forefront idea, because they're an implementation arm. They're also saying, you know, how can we then best help countries to give them the kind of support that's required? So, you know, earlier on it was spoken around, you know, frameworks in terms of strategies, in terms of policies, in terms of experts, in terms of big tech. How can you bring all of these different things together? And that was literally the approach from the AU. Then the next sort of pillar is really around Smart Africa. Now, Smart Africa is another leg that is birthed from the AU. And their mandate has been, let's put out a blueprint. That blueprint is going to define our international relationships and where we stand. So they were more focused on how do we attract the necessary and the right kind of, you know, attention to us as a continent. Then you have the AUC, which is the commission, which has just literally, I think it's this month, we've just literally finished off the updated version of the continental sort of AI strategy and policy. And that would be published soon. But to give you some insights into it, it's really around how do we leverage us as a continent in terms of everyone's different strengths. So what their approach is let's start defining ourselves in terms of getting a more solid approach, right? And that solid approach could be, you know, in terms of the Agenda 2063, which is really around how do we foster, you know, a lifestyle for anyone and everyone that is of benefit to anyone and everyone that belongs to the continent, right? Then there's also a force in terms of how do we then allow for technology to bridge things like the African Free Trade Agreement. So how do we get ourselves to a place where, you know, we actually get and fruitate and see what does a borderless sort of Africa look like, right? Is it possible? Great. To what extent? So what does it mean if we bring down our borders? What does it mean if we have a nomad visa put into place? What does it mean if, for example, you know, we have, you know, like digital taxation that some companies are some countries are talking about. So that's really the sort of stance of that. And then I kind of broke it down into the different areas, but I probably won't go into too much of detail here because we can probably get lost in it. I think the main aim that I want us to kind of really drive home around policies is that it's an active space, South Africa included. We have an AI working group that has been put together as part of the DCDT, so the Digital Communications sort of ministry, as well as the Ministry of Science and Innovation. And I'm fortunate to be part of that working group. So there's a lot that is actually being put forward and being driven at this point in time. So, I would urge everyone here, as much as you're hearing different things from everyone from the continent, like just really take the time to understand where it actually fits in from a bigger picture perspective, right? And how can we best leverage that? And I think later on, we'll probably delve into like specifics around which countries are doing what on the continent to give us a better idea and a better stance. So as I mentioned, these are the different countries within the continent that have an AI strategy in place versus an AI policy. So Rwanda is up and front in terms of being the only country on the continent that has a policy in place. Okay. Now, the southern part of Africa really works slightly different to the rest. And I think I want to make the distinction. So the usual way or the usual stance or flow is generally you put up a policy. You formulate a strategy. That strategy then dictates or helps to formulate your policy. And then your policy is then taken and as an input into legislation or it becoming enacted. Okay, that's the usual flow of stance. However, within the south of Africa, South Africa included, we do things kind of slightly different, right? And that is you have a policy that you come up with first, and then your strategy is your execution arm of your policy. So you do your strategy and you do your act or legislation at the same time. So slightly different to the rest. And I think, that's been one of the most major focuses that we've seen to date. And there's always a confusion between what is a strategy, what is a policy, and what is an actual legislation, and why do they all matter? There's been even conversations around, do we actually need a strategy at all? And, it all is very much dependent on the localization sort of aspect of how you actually approach that. One of the largest issues that I have within the policy space is that there's so many different voices, and they either are getting drowned, or you have those that are well-funded, that are, the guys that have the loudest voices. And it not necessarily is saying what has to be said, or it's not necessarily letting us understand or filter the information the way that it is required to be filtered. So, again, to the point of misinformation and disinformation. And I think, again, media has quite a large role to play in terms of helping to get the right narrative out, if possible. Okay, so those were just in-depth use cases, which we'll go into later on. So, at this point in time, I am not at all jealous about the media industry, because it's probably one of the toughest positions to be in at this point in time. Having technology thrown at you, having to verify information, whether or not where it's coming from, what is the source of it, and what is the origination, I guess. And, we've seen so many different things kind of happen in the space. We've seen ourselves, having to verify that we're human, which I hate doing. We've seen ourselves also, having a badge or a watermark, as earlier stipulated, that this is AI generated content. We also have had, deep fakes and the likes of that that we've been privy to. I think all the way from the AUC commissioner himself, who's been privy to deep fakes, all the way down to us as ordinary citizens, and I think journalists themselves alike within the context of South Africa have had some net effect to that. We've also seen large amounts of contract violations and copyright, right? I mean, what content is actually deemed yours in the space becomes quite a key sort of conversation. If I had to ask ChatGPT a question, is it my content or is it its content? Or is it a combination of both, right? Like those are the type of things that we need to really start having, active steps towards in terms of answering those questions. So when we have to talk about the technology, just for a moment, so we have ANI, which is artificial narrow intelligence, which is very much a one-directional sort of conversation around, you input information and it regurgitates it in various different forms. Then you have AGI, and AGI is really around artificial general intelligence, which again is, can you, almost contextualize your environment, and can you almost behave human-like, okay, within that environment. So can you understand things in real time? Can you act and behave, and can you make decisions accordingly? Then you have ASI, which is the whole, doomed scenario, which is artificial super intelligence. Now, when it comes to, that particular realm of it, I think that we're quite a long, far way from that. For us, the technology is immature. As much as there's a lot of innovation that's happening on a daily basis, there's I think there was some scary stats of like 600 odd startups actually was birthed after ChatGPT was launched within the first 30 days. 600. Okay. So like innovation is happening, absolutely. But I don't think the technology is mature enough just yet. So there's something that's kind of happening in between these different phases. Between ANI and AGI, we have something called ACI. ACI is artificial capable intelligence. Now, what does that mean? That means that, AI can now kind of have access to all of my bank accounts. It can have access to all my insurance policies. It can have access to all of my telco information. And it is then acting on my behalf. Okay, so it's making semi decisions for me. Okay, but within a very limited environment. So this is what we call modularization, right? Or modular behavior, where it's about taking real-time decision making within the context, right? And giving it some context, but it's a very limited context and it's very static context. So, for example, it would make a decision, hey, Lavina, you've been, subscribed to Netflix or some streaming platform, but you don't watch it. So, it would auto-generate a letter on my behalf to the actual, company and have that, deactivated for me, as an example. So those are the kind of things where we're kind of heading towards that will eventually get us to the AGI state, right? And I think, within the media industry, if we had to unpack the impact of all of this, I think let's go through it. So one is definitely around images, text, audio, video, 3D, and we have the rest of it, right? So what does this all mean? This means that, all the way from you within your production house, within your operations of your newsrooms, or whether it is, incorporating a chatbot that can be multilingual, in real time, or whether it be, let's have a search engine, an AI search engine in the media industry, which I think is probably one of the best sort of possible areas to start with, because you sit with so much of content, right? So how do you develop your own search tool engine for your industry that literally collects and has like a common base of information? And that way you start streamlining the origination of false information. You also then start streamlining misinformation and disinformation. Now, with that in place, I think you can then start building on all the other sexy tools that are out there, like whether it is, the Gen AI stuff, or whether it's neural networks and the deep learning, or whether it's even getting robotics as an example included in this conversation. So, whether we talk about incorporating something on a, conversational basis, or whether we talk about it from a data perspective, we still need those foundational blocks. And those foundational blocks is you have to get your data and the source of your data absolutely accurate before you put any other piece of technology on it. And I know some of the previous speakers kind of touched on other technologies like blockchain and quantum computing, which I think would be absolute value adds when combined with AI, if it's done in a very right context. So this is just a further deep dive, and I apologize for the sort of, minimalistic sort of font that's there, but I'm happy to, or I'm sure this will be shared with everyone as well. So, one of the interesting sort of concepts for me is us as humans, right? Where do we factor in terms of the translation of technology? We know that we want to eventually get to a point where we have the balance between man and machine, but what exactly is going to happen to get us there? And I think this is where we have opportune moments. Those opportune moments is, one, don't play into the FOMO, because I think that's a huge sort of net effect that we find in industries as technologists or as people that are at the forefront of it. As much as jobs are being taken away, there is also AI that is creating at least, I think it's like 116 odd million odd jobs, right? So there is that as well, but nobody talks about that. So that whole area is one. I think the other is, let's hype the right kind of things that need to be hyped when we have to talk about AI. Okay, so what does that mean? That means yes, let's talk about the technology. Let's talk about people that's applying the technology in the right sort of use case areas that has a large impact. So for example, AI has already been used on the continent in terms of flooding that a country had, right, to help its citizens. But how many of you have heard of it? Probably no one, right? So, to my point, it's mass impacting lives on ground, but yet we have no idea of its true potential, or of how we can actually localize it to our African context and our African needs, right? So, like, those for me are the two sort of large areas that I kind of want to really punt. I have twin girls, they're 15, so teenagers in today's day and age is definitely something very different to kind of deal with. And I think one of the pieces of advice that I kind of give them, and I think it's still very relevant and true for us in today's day and age, is every nanosecond of every day we have a choice. And we're going to get things wrong, absolutely, but we're going to get things right as well. And we also have the chance to change course at any given point in time. We're creating this piece of technology. Let's remember that. It's not creating us, not yet. So, that's the hope that we have. And, that's what I'd like for all of us to kind of take away from. So thank you so much.
We're going to talk about is how things have changed. There was a time where this was the computer, right? Everyone remember this? Remember the LP? You remember that? That's how music used to be. Who would have thunk that would come back into fashion? This is so old that Michael Jackson's still black and alive. And that's what the computer of today is. That's what the internet used to look like. And that's what the internet looks like now. You can see the cat pictures. Mobile devices, the computer of today. Who has a smartphone, right? Who has an Apple? Who has an Android phone? Anyone still hanging on to a BlackBerry? BBM doesn't work, people. These devices can do everything that a desktop or laptop computer can do, and they are wonderfully mobile. In fact, we're on them all the time. At least now we know who he was speaking to. I wore my Holmes Brothers T-shirt in his honor today. So, as you were saying, where does everyone get their news from? From Facebook. And I took this picture of a guy in Dar es Salaam about 10 years ago, according to the Pew Research. the 44% of Americans get their news from Facebook, and we know how polarized and problematic that is. And that's what we're going to talk about. What did that get us? Trump. And it's probably going to get us him again. But what I'm particularly interested in, because I run a small media business, we publish a piece of paper, amongst others, in the digital world, but we flipped during 2020 from 90% digital to, 90% print to 90% digital. We're one of the few media houses that were able to do it. And in spite of the fact that Facebook and Google have stolen our revenue. And I wouldn't have a problem if they weren't so thoroughly dishonest and manipulative and frankly evil. And I'm going to demonstrate to you why. So for every dollar spent online, according to Morgan Stanley and Gordon Barrell, 85 cents goes. These numbers are about 2 years old. It's probably 95 cents now. In 2016, Facebook managed to convince everybody to stop doing print journalism and start doing video because everybody was watching video on Facebook. So all of these great publications around the world dumped all of their titles, their print journalists, and started hiring video people, except Facebook lied. They said they lied by 900%. Politely, the article says overstated, they lied. What people were actually watching was 3 seconds. And they knew about this for 2 years and they didn't tell anyone. Same thing happened in 2018. The guy on the right makes a really good point. You know, they lied to all the media organizations. The media organizations fired all the old graybeard journos who knew how to write a story. And then the news executives looked up and discovered that Facebook wasn't giving them all the traffic and all the money, was giving them some traffic and some money, and Facebook and Google were just taking the traffic and the money for themselves. And there's a lot of research that now shows that. Just so you get a sense of this, the average video posted was nearly 4 minutes, but people only watched 10 seconds. And that's what Facebook counted as a view. Google's even more deceptive. Once a liar, always a liar, right? Malusi Gigaba. So why is it that when we see that these technology platforms over and over and over are lying, are deceiving, are behaving in the most anti-competitive, corrupt way, does anyone still believe them? And sadly, programmatic advertising has taken over the world. There is no other way to buy advertising. And Bob Hoffman, who is a very good commentator on the ad industry in the States, I quoted him in an article for the Financial Mail in 2021 or 22, and he was saying Facebook metrics are completely unreliable. Anyone who believes them is an idiot. And yet, people still do. Why are we still trusting Facebook and Google? Why is anyone? Let me show you a bit of advice. This is Francis Haugen, the whistleblower, who used Facebook's own internal research to unveil or expose to the world that Facebook knew how damaging Instagram was to teenage girls and still did it. This is Facebook's own research. They knew. I've written over and over and over. Facebook and Instagram, Snapchat and Discord are a vast pedophile network, quote unquote, according to the US government. Facebook has enabled pedophilia on an industrial scale, and yet people are still giving them their money. Facebook realized they could do something about it. They could change their algorithm, but they'd lose money. They know this. There are emails between executives that I've published over and over showing just how deceptive they are. As one of the US Democrats said to them, or senators, I can never really tell between senators and Republicans. People explain it to me all the time. They're making money. They're doing all of this because they're making hand over fist. In 2016, The Economist spoke about Mark Zuckerberg and said he had control over more people than anyone in history since Emperor Constantine, who was the emperor of the Roman emperor who controlled most of the world. But what has Zuckerberg done with this control? I mean, I'm Jewish, so I can tell you, I have never in my life met an unintentional white supremacist. I can tell you, if you go to the Avia beer meetings, if they still have them, nobody there just like wandered in and became a white supremacist. Facebook, the German government discovered that Facebook was suggesting to Germans that they join neo-Nazi groups. People make these honeypots, these brand new accounts, and see what happens and see how people will speak to them. And what happens is truly extraordinary. Brand new accounts suddenly get spammed, either with pedophilia content or join neo-Nazis or disinformation. All of this is because Mark Zuckerberg is uncontrollable. This is an email from 2008 when he was talking about buying Instagram. Rather than compete with Instagram, they just bought it. They did the same with WhatsApp. During the pandemic, they refused to take down anti-vaxxer information. Joe Biden, the president of America, even said they're killing people. They just ignored him and carried on. Why? Because combating misinformation is just too hard. So what does Facebook do? They only have safety teams in English. They only care about whether their American customers are offended or not. They don't care about if you speak Swahili or Hindi or you live in some part of the rest of the world. They're not interested. 90% of Facebook's misinformation projects is around English, and English is the smallest language. Professor Scott Galloway, I like this guy, wrote a book called The Four, exposing just how bad the business model of all of these people are. And he wrote this piece in 2020, pointing this out. He's the biggest oligarch. He has the control over what over 2 billion people see, the most powerful, dangerous man in the world. And you can't fire him. He controls 60% of Facebook stock. Facebook, Facebook, WhatsApp, Messenger, and Instagram are the four of the biggest channels in the world, controlled by a man who defends neo-Nazis, who deny the Holocaust, and he's also Jewish. You can't take this guy seriously. You know, this was a groundbreaking piece of research done in Switzerland last year by the guys at the bottom, and then this woman commented on in this media professor in the States. The content that Google is using for search is extraordinary. That's the annual revenue based on information they have gleaned from scraping news websites. So if you go and search for something and you find the information on Google's page, you don't click through to the article. You just read Google search information, and that is the great con, and they got us all. We all thought they would be wonderful, but actually they've just been stealing money from the fourth estate. 40% of Google's revenue, according to this very exact, I mean, they're Swiss, right? They're probably going to be very good. I once met a Jewish journalist from New York. A mutual friend introduced us and said, "You've got to meet this guy. He's so Jewish, he makes you look Swiss." $176 million in Switzerland alone is how much money Google makes from news content. And of course they deny it, and they say the metrics are wrong. There is so much information. This is what these guys, Prayer Advice and Partners, said, that content increases the attractiveness. Without this content, people wouldn't use Google as well, because Google wouldn't give them the answers immediately, because Google is ripping it off, and it's just going to get worse with AI. Our business models in the media can no longer rely on advertising in any way. Look at the kind of other stuff they're up to. I've been writing for 10 years about the fact that when you tell Google on an Android phone not to track, they carry on tracking you. When you wipe the phone, they can still track you. There have been so many court cases where people have said to governments have said to Google, stop doing. I had pages and pages of this kind of stuff. I just dropped all of them. There's a woman called Shoshana Zuboff who coined the phrase surveillance capitalism. It is so interesting to me because I grew up in apartheid South Africa. I grew up in a surveillance regime. I was terrified at university when those drunk, arseholes from the security branch drove around taking pictures of us. Then our pictures would appear in somewhere. Then they'd claim something. I know what it's like. We all know what it's like to live under surveillance states. This is being done on an industrial scale by Facebook and Google. They know more about us than anything else. You heard about that famous story about the girl who started buying things at Target the American grocery chain or department store, and they sent her an email. They knew she was pregnant before she knew she was pregnant based on the things she was buying. It's just going to get worse. Programmatic advertising is the new smoking, which is what that slide's supposed to say. I said it. Bob Hoffman, again, for every dollar an advertiser spends, 3 cents is actually seen by a real person. Let's run through a few of these statistics now. There's been a massive trial against Google in the States, started last October. The judge is still looking at it. The evidence they have produced is unbelievable. Google has completely manipulated, lied, bullshitted, deceived, squashed, been anti-competitive. Everything you can think of them doing, they make, Steinhoff look like angels. They're so bad. Marcus Jooste would never fit in there. He's not dirty enough. That's how much of $12 billion is being lost to online fraud. It's just unbelievable. It gets worse. This is a professor at the University of Baltimore that I interviewed, and he's saying 20 to 50% of all advertising is fraudulent, of programmatic advertising. This is a research by Juniper Research. They're one of the big research houses. I quote them all the time. They are less fabulous with their research. Their research is always good. And they said last year, 2023, $84 billion of ad spend was lost to fraud. It's just remarkable. It's going to go up to $172 billion. And I see ad agencies and I say to them, you're wasting your money. It's not being seen by a human being. And it's not giving the results you think it is. This is Jared Sinman, who wrote a piece on Mark Lives last month about it. Between 20 and 60% of ad spend is fraudulent, whereas $60 billion, imagine what we could do with $60 billion, is never seen by humans. Bob Hoffman again, these are hackers who hack into US government cybersecurity command. You don't think they're hacking ad tech systems and stealing money from that. Whenever I speak to cybersecurity people, they just laugh and they go, the advertising industry is funding, forget about grey listing. The advertising industry is funding not just, cyber criminals, but, great enterprises of cyber criminals. Eugene Kaspersky from Kaspersky Security, the Russian company, told me once the cyber criminal gang have medical aid, they have leave forms. You can buy software off the shelf to hack into things. You don't think this is happening with ad tech. This is a piece I wrote for Forbes. I'm very happy to have been able to point this out pointedly, that, and using, the comments from all of the media houses on the day, Google has managed to do what apartheid couldn't do, and it's crushing the fourth estate. And it's a real problem. It's a real problem because journalism is the fourth estate. So as pissed off as I am about it, and as much as I pointed out, I think like any other business, we got to find a new business model. How's this? Let's talk about AI-generated content. Sports Illustrated shut down. The actual real-life journalists didn't get a job, but Google gave a contract to the AI company that ripped off Sports Illustrated. And there's just hundreds of these stories. The guy who ran Gawker Media, and they were this business that was built on Facebook and Facebook referrals and Facebook traffic. They eventually got closed down. They were not the freest journalists. Adrian Besson presented these at the competition hearing in March. You can see News 24's legitimate story on the left and the AI-generated fake story on the right. And there's just lots of this. The one other point he made is about disinformation and how, attacks on the credibility and the integrity of journalists happens all along. And whenever it's a woman journalist, there's always threats of rape and other forms of violence. And this is the free-for-all that the internet unfortunately is. And the reason all of these big companies worry only about misinformation in English is because of Section 230 of the American, I think it's the Decency code, Decency Act something. Anyway, this section 230 gives the tech publishing platforms, they are not responsible for what people publish. It's unbelievable. In our journalistic understanding, you are responsible for what you publish, but not Facebook and Google and Twitter and any of these other people. It's incredible. They're big moves to change that around. Let's talk about enshittification. I did promise Lloyd I wouldn't swear, but I'm quoting the great Cory Doctorow. And he wrote this piece last year, and the central, this is his intro, houses for an intro. The bottom line is all of these platforms no longer give a shit about us or their customers or their advertisers. They just make money and they're printing it. And the other thing that Ishmael Davidson, the CEO of News 24, Media 24, pointed out is they don't pay tax in South Africa. They're taking 11 billion rand a year straight out the door and paying it in Ireland. He is now, Cory Doctorow has updated this thing, and he now calls it the Enshitter scene. And I think you can agree with us. I was looking for one of my other stories I wrote last year, where the headline was, "The Titanic never sank on TikTok." You know, the kind of crazy misinformation and and you know what these conspiracy theories are like. They don't deliberately say, yes, I totally believe it. They go, oh, there's something in it. That wouldn't be allowed in the context of responsible publishing, but these tech firms aren't encumbered by it. So the only solution I found personally is to delete Facebook. I deleted it off my phone. I have never missed anything. I even found out Stephen Curtis got the job at the Money Show without looking at social media. Someone else did and told me. But hey, my life continues. My son's 7. I deleted it 7 years ago. Facebook, Instagram, I haven't missed a thing.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event on AI and the media space. And I think, a lot of the conversation so far has kind of, as the Master of Ceremony said, it's kind of been quite a progression, right? We've gone from thinking more large, widespread about artificial intelligence, and we got someone to come in and give a policy perspective on that. And then we got to look at it from, the different corporations and how they kind of benefiting from this. And I think it's fitting to kind of follow that up with a conversation around disinformation specifically. And this today, I'm going to be speaking specifically about disinformation within the realm of democracy and how it's really affected us. And I'm going to be using elections, not just in South Africa, but across different African countries to actually show how disinformation is actually impacting the way in which we understand disinformation, the way in which we receive information, and how all of this actually impacts us on a level within the political realm. And so, when we think about AI, and I think throughout my talk, I hope that people kind of keep coming back to this point, is that artificial intelligence is not just a technological issue, right? It's also a governance issue. And I think, with how accessible we are with social media and the internet, I think it's important that, we also think about ways in which how we can address and combat something as crucial as disinformation. So kind of just to get started, 2024 was kind of seen as this really important year, right? Over 2 billion people are expected to cast their vote or have already voted this year alone, right? That's more than 60 countries will be having a national election. So there's other countries outside of these 60 that are also going to be having, local elections and provincial elections, if those are a thing. So we've seen that 2024 is a huge year for democracy, right? It's seen as this really great year where democracies all around the world are going to celebrate their ability to cast their vote. But on the other spectrum of this, we've seen that, according to the World Economic Forum, that they've actually ranked AI-driven disinformation as a major global threat for at least the next 2 years. So within the next 2 years, we're actually going to see disinformation and AI-driven disinformation having a huge impact in the way we understand democracy and the world that we live in just generally. So that is kind of what my presentation is really going to look at, is how AI-driven disinformation has really affected elections and democracy in Africa more broadly, and what we can actually do about this. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about artificial intelligence. I think people have kind of covered it well enough. So just generally, artificial intelligence is any type of technology that gives computers or enables computers to essentially simulate different elements of human intelligence and problem-solving capabilities, right? So, for example, something like Netflix recommendations. That's an artificial intelligence model that's giving you those recommendations. You don't need to make that decision necessarily yourself because you're now getting recommended, movies that you can watch. Same thing for your social media feed. That's also something that is also an artificial intelligence model, right? How your algorithm gives you the information that you see, the posts that you see, that is influenced by it learning what you like and don't like. And so that's effectively what artificial intelligence is, right? But artificial intelligence has also kind of been around for quite a while. It's not a new thing. Even back in the 90s, right? Google, in the creation of Gmail and all of that, we're using artificial intelligence models for spam folders, right? Because your spam folder is an example of artificial intelligence. So, it's not necessarily a new idea, but it includes now, in this day and age, a huge range of different subfields like machine learning and, of course, natural language processing, which is something that, if anybody's used ChatGPT will know about. You've seen that's basically what natural language processing is. But there are also some negatives to artificial intelligence, right? And sometimes you always find people that are on one end of the spectrum. You have people who are really pro artificial intelligence, right? Who really just want to see what the next big thing is. How can we push AI into the next realm of society or whatever it is? And then you have people who are really, really skeptical of it and see it, as the world coming to an end of sorts. And I think a more appropriate response is really to find a middle ground between those two, because even though there are all these great things that you can do with artificial intelligence, like I don't need to now sit and choose what movie to watch. I can let, Netflix recommend me a movie, for example, right? ChatGPT, I don't necessarily need to write emails anymore. ChatGPT can do that for me. Not that I do that, but the option is there, right? So, but on the other end of that is, we're seeing artificial intelligence almost in some ways overstep, right? We see it in the art industry where artists are actually struggling because they are, their livelihoods are being threatened by artificial intelligence, which, would take maybe an artist a few weeks to paint something. It takes artificial intelligence a few minutes to do. And so, there's a lot of negatives that I think people also need to be aware of so that we can make more conscious decisions around how we approach artificial intelligence. And another one is, of course, disinformation on social media. And so I didn't want to necessarily share a real life example because I think it would have maybe been a bit too controversial. So I created one. And I said, I created a tweet that said, Stuart's new chocolate bar gave me abs, right? And this is essentially how disinformation works. It seems like it is just innocent, right? It seems that, it is just this thing that, someone is just saying or, whatever. But there's some serious ramifications around this. And it goes deeper into how we get information and how we understand it. And so on the surface, we might see this as, okay, I've got a chocolate brand and, it's claiming that if you eat my chocolate every day, you're going to get abs. But what behind the scenes might be happening is that it might actually be putting other chocolate brands into dispute, right? It might be trying to undermine those chocolate brands. And, that then kind of hurts the whole kind of competitive market, right? And so if you think about that in terms of how we think about democracy and elections, right? These type of ideas might seem innocent, but they actually have really deep ramifications for how we engage with democracy. So what is kind of like AI-driven disinformation? So essentially, it's the use of AI technologies to create and disseminate misleading or false information, right? And sometimes people kind of confuse misinformation and disinformation, but they're different ideas, right? Misinformation is basically what I said, right? It's just, oh, my chocolate bar gives you apps. It's wrong. It's false information. That is what misinformation is. Disinformation is the intentional dissemination and creation of false news in order to change perceptions around a certain thing for someone's benefit, right? And so that's a really important thing to understand, is that the goal of disinformation is to deceive and to manipulate, right? And I was in a discussion last week on disinformation, and someone said, but if the disinformation is helping us to question things that we never really thought to question, is it really a bad thing? But the question that you always have to come back to is, who is it going to benefit? Because while, we have this influx of information, no one who has necessarily good agendas is going to want to lie to you. And disinformation is spreading, false information, false lies. So that's something that is quite important to keep in mind around disinformation. That yes, it might raise things that you might have never thought of, but there's always going to be a reason behind it. And so we usually see AI-driven technology, disinformation on things like social media platforms, right? I hate going on Twitter, now called X, just because of the influx of just nonsense that I get on my page. And so we see this, right? How this has impacted us. But sometimes it's a bit difficult to look at it from kind of like a wider picture. And so, just some examples before we get into how it impacts democracy is really, things like deep fakes, right? Things like the use of bots and fake accounts to kind of try and drive engagement and to push fake narratives, and something called astroturfing, which is essentially, it's a way in which people will create fake organizations and they will push bots onto that to make it seem like an issue that isn't really an issue, actually has a large group of people following it. And so your automatic, thought will be, oh, this is a big pressing issue, right? When in actuality, it's not. It's insignificant. But there's a reason why they want to focus on those issues. So that's kind of what astroturfing is. So the question is really around why we are seeing AI disinformation now, right? Like I've said before, AI is something that is not new. We've seen it for years and years and years. So why specifically now has it entered the realm of information? What is it? And so, this is quite a complex topic, and there's a lot of different factors, but there are three that sort of really come to the forefront, right? The first one is, of course, advancements in AI, right? We've seen, earlier China being a superpower in terms of, all of these technologies, and they have now the computing capabilities to be able to do some really amazing stuff, right? But it's not just about the big quantum computers, right? It's also about what we can do with our own machines, right? Computers are just getting better. The processing power is getting better. And so this allows us to do more, right? Right now, Google has their own sort of like cloud computing. So anyone can go on and they can actually lean into that kind of cloud computer if their computer doesn't have enough processing power. So, these are advancements that are really pushing AI forward. And so that's one of the reasons why we're seeing AI-driven disinformation in today's age. The other reason is, of course, access to the internet. Did you know that South Africa has one of the highest internet usages in the world? On average, a South African spends at least 9 hours a day on the internet, right? So, it's sometimes crazy to think about. And, in South Africa, we have, the digital divide, right? Not everybody has access to these type of things. And already we have one of the highest internet usages in the world. So imagine if more people get access. And so access to internet is another reason why we are seeing a lot more AI-driven disinformation these days. And the last thing is, and this is something that's already been spoken about, but underfunding newsrooms, right? We're seeing a huge decrease in the number of journalists and the number of newsrooms that are available to us. And the biggest way to combat disinformation is by pushing back with actual fact. But news, which is supposed to be doing that, is being underfunded in replace of things like new technologies. And this is a concern, right? And so we've seen how these new systems are being used on social media platforms to try and undermine or for, ulterior motives, right? So what are then some of the impacts, right? And I'm going to use 4 examples of different elections that have happened recently, and we're going to speak to each one of them. So the first one is manipulation of voter perceptions, right? So this is where AI-driven sort of like disinformation campaigns, they create and spread false information about candidates, about political parties, policies, anything like that, right? And it can actually shift how voters will perceive the election. And in some cases, they will just choose not to vote at all. So it might actually even affect voter turnout. But of course, this is something that is very difficult to, actually causally prove, right? But there is some evidence to suggest that this happens. And so one example of this is that in, the lead up to the South African elections that happened now in May, there were a whole bunch of deepfake videos that were circling around different social media sites like WhatsApp and Twitter that was essentially, all of these different world leaders and, figures like celebrities telling people to go and vote for a certain political party or don't vote for this political party, right? And this is how AI-driven disinformation is used to kind of manipulate voter perceptions. Because let's say if you see Obama, for example, saying, oh, go and vote for this party, right? You might feel more swayed because now you're like, okay, this might actually be real. But it's all fake. It's a deep fake video. And this is something that is often sometimes easy to miss. And if you spread it on one platform, you'll find it will spread so quickly, right? So if you share it once on Twitter, by the next day, you'll probably see that it's gone across all of the major news platforms or social media platforms. And so one of the negative impacts about this is that it can mislead people when they're trying to make, at least in some case, an informed decision about who they want to vote for, right? How can you vote for someone if you're hearing all of these things about them online? And that gets me to the second one, which is deepening social divisions, right? A big danger of disinformation is that it runs on antagonizing people, right? It runs on trying to sow, dissent between different groups of people. And we've seen this, going onto Twitter nowadays is so polarizing. It's so difficult to actually ask a question because most of the comments will probably just be, oh, how do you not know this? Or they'll be arguing about it, right? So it's very difficult to actually engage, in normal human interactions on social media because of how serious disinformation has spread on these type of platforms. And so, for example, during the DRC election, we saw that there were actually there was a election campaign that had happened, and there was a bit of violence at that campaign rally. And one of the political parties went on social media and claimed that it was instigated by one of their rivals. And what this actually did was it actually deepened a lot of tension between these two rival organizations. And there were a few pictures and stuff of fake pictures of people in the rival regalia at this campaign rally. And so people just assumed that, this is violence, this is instigating something. And it really deepened those divides between groups of people over an election, which is supposed to unite, and bring people together to cast your vote, is now becoming a really topical conversation that is deepening divides and actually sparked even more violence after this. And so these things don't just remain within the social media realm. They get brought out into the real world in the form of things like violence. And that's where we can actually see it at its worst, right? And the third thing is that it undermines trust in democratic institutions. We've seen, right, a lot of research has shown that there has been a huge decrease in trust in democratic institutions. People are just not seeing that democracy is working for them, right? And one of the ways in which this is exacerbated, it's not the cause, but it's exacerbated, is through disinformation. And a good example of this is in the Kenya 2022 election, right? Where there was a huge campaign to try and just discredit the election commission, so much so that people to this day don't accept the election results, right? This is how these kind of things, really play and mess with people, because instead of working with the next administration, people are trying to fight that process. And, there's nothing necessarily wrong with asking questions or being critical of democratic institutions and how they might work in a country, right? Because no system is perfect. But the problem is that with disinformation, it undermines the ideals and the values that that country or that system is built on. And that is where it becomes dangerous. And lastly, one of the other major impacts that disinformation has on elections specifically is disruption of the election process, right? And this, a good example of this is in Nigeria. They had an election last year in 2023. And what this means is that the actual disinformation will be spread about when the election is happening, where it's happening, those type of things fall under this category of disrupting the election processes themselves. And in 2023, we saw in Nigeria that there were instances where people were getting so confused that they weren't really sure whether they were able to vote or not, right? And these are things that a simple post that you see on Facebook or Twitter can actually see, put those ideas into your head. And so it created quite a bit of confusion during that election period. And I mean, we've not just seen it in Nigeria, we've also seen it in South Africa. There were a few changes to South Africa's election system this year. And there was a whole wave of confusion that the IEC was trying to fight against just because of the disinformation around it. And so, disinformation, and especially AI-driven disinformation, has a huge impact on how we understand and see elections, right? It goes really sometimes into the deeper psyche of voters and influences them. And so it's not necessarily something that should be taken lightly. But there are also some things that can be done. I don't want to stand here and be a doomsayer. I think, we live in a world where there is a lot of technology available. And, these things can be prevented, they can be combated, they can be stopped. And one way in which to do this is actually using artificial intelligence. Even though it is helped exacerbate disinformation, it can also be used to combat disinformation, right? There's a lot of tools that are now being developed, not just by social media companies, but by other companies, to try and combat disinformation using different models, like detecting whether something is disinformation or not, going through a checklist, and also trying to stop the spread of it. So if something gets picked up that it is disinformation, they can kick in and prevent it from spreading even further. So these are some tools that are used or being tested to try and combat this. The second one, and one of the bigger ones, is regulation and policy, right? We can't just have open, gates with artificial intelligence, right? Because artificial intelligence at the end of the day is a tool, and regulation and policy help to ensure that that tool is going to benefit everyone, not just the select few or not just the companies that built them. And so that is why things like regulating how we engage with this information, how we engage with information more broadly, will also help in regulating and preventing these type of things from spreading further. Then the final one is, of course, public awareness and education. And this is not necessarily to say that people are not, don't understand the media landscape, because I think now most people do really have a good idea of it. But it's more so about working with different communities on how to come up with localized plans on how to combat these things and how to have conversations with each other about them. So yeah, that is my presentation. And just to kind of conclude, I don't think that artificial intelligence is necessarily the doom and gloom. But there are some real dangers, as we've seen with this presentation, especially when it comes to things like elections and democracy. But we should take a critical approach to artificial intelligence, not just let it run wild, but be, critical and make sure that it's actually working for us and not against us. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone who has spoken today. It's been absolutely fantastic, but now we have the opportunity to ask our panelists to go into greater depth. I want to actually start with Arthur on a matter of clarity, really. Arthur is the author of a book called Hitchhiker's Guide to AI, to which I hope the answer is 42, Arthur. I'd like to kick us off. Generally, when people talk about artificial intelligence, I find that we don't all have the same understanding of what that is. So do you think you could give us earlier, Lavina did run us through, but an idea of what artificial intelligence is and where it comes from?
I won't give you a definition because I believe Lavina has given you a definition, but I'd like to give a context rather, because most discussion around artificial intelligence today is on generative AI, creating content from AI or creating images or faking content, especially video content from AI. And because the media coverage is almost exclusively around those kinds of uses of AI, it gives the impression that AI is only about generative AI, and that is part of the inspiration for writing this book. The answer is 42, but there are many other answers as well, and the intention was to take the reader through a journey of how AI evolved and the many different uses of AI. So, for example, in sports, and in particular in soccer, La Liga in Spain, the Premier League in that country, uses AI for match planning, for putting together all the information that they have on weather conditions, sunshine on the field, traffic conditions, etc., to plan fixtures and then to broadcast those matches at optimal times when there's even sunshine across a field, for example. It sounds simple, but it requires drawing on numerous parameters to understand what is the best time to broadcast a game or to start a game. And they're using AI for that. But going deeper, they're using it to analyze the movement of players on the field. And for example, the coach can see exactly the work rate of each of their players and the opposition players. But where it comes incredibly useful is giving them a sense of whether a player is operating or playing suboptimally because their activity level is lower than it usually is on average. In South Africa, we have a form of AI. If you've ever been to a soccer match in this country, you'll know if the coach needs to know when to replace or substitute a player, they just look at the crowd, and the crowd goes like that. And then you better substitute that player or else. But in La Liga, the coach is able to draw on the data. So anything that pulls in a large amount of data, processes it, analyzes, and then produces new information or new understanding of the information, typically is using AI. One of the other examples I use is the Oracle headquarters in Europe is in a city called Reading in England. And on their campus, they have a beehive connected to the cloud. And they have sensors running into the beehive, measuring anything from the weight of the bees, to the weight of the honey, to the atmospheric conditions in and around the hive, to the sounds the bees are making, and also monitoring the patterns of movement of the bees. And to cut a long story short, this allows them to literally interpret what the bees are communicating. So AI is being used to interpret the language of bees. And these are both examples that go back 6 years to 2018, when I was able to witness them firsthand. And at that stage, already able to see the massive impact AI was making on improving the world, making it a better place for humanity, for nature, for bees, for soccer players, coaches, and audiences. So at all levels, AI is bringing improvements to society. And it goes far beyond generative AI, and it extends into any area where you're able to collect large amounts of data from a variety of sources and analyze them to gain new knowledge of your environment.
Thanks. Arthur, I just want to follow up that question. There was an article in The Economist, I think it's yesterday. It's quite skeptical about the use of artificial intelligence in the actual production processes of corporations or manufacturers and so on. A pessimistic article, but your book shows that there's quite an increasing uptake of artificial intelligence in the general business environment.
When you read articles like that, they usually are, again, looking at the use of generative AI for product design and the like. But when you look at the use of AI in monitoring what's happening in an organization, in a factory especially, monitoring the health of machines, for example, and predicting when a machine is likely to break down, and therefore allowing for what they call predictive maintenance. It increases the efficiency and operations of a business dramatically, and it's completely unrelated to generative AI or using AI to make decisions for you. It's AI helping businesses to make decisions. And when you look at supply chain management, logistics, and the like, AI makes it so much more efficient that the organizations using AI become that much more competitive than those who aren't using AI. Eventually, everyone will be on the same level of having AI built into all their operations, allowing them all to achieve the same level of efficiency. So it becomes a ticket to the game rather than a differentiator. Sports is a good example where all the leagues are now using those AI tools, so it's no longer a differentiator. But 6 years ago, Spain had a massive differentiator. So it's not a case of whether it should do the work of humans or not. It's a case of, if you want to remain competitive, you need to see where it can make your business more efficient.
Thanks. Thank you, Arthur. As my mother would say, van die ossel na die os. So I'm going to change subjects slightly. I would like to call on Deji our chairman, Deji Haastrup, who is a communications expert, but has also recently published a book on propaganda. And Deji, I would like to ask you what your insights are on AI's impact on propaganda as a tool. From my understanding of propaganda, it's actually quite a simple affair, and the toolbook has been running. I mean, the playbook has been running since the dawn of time, othering people, those kinds of things, creating division.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. Can you hear me? Am I audible? Right. Okay. So I wrote this book about 9 months ago. It's titled The Art of Propaganda, and the subtitle is Shaping Public Opinion and Putting Society at Risk. I wrote the book during lockdown, COVID lockdown, but this is a subject that I have been following for many years. As a matter of fact, since the 1980s. My special area of interest is to study how society evolves and the impact of political communication and technology in that evolution. Propaganda it started as a benign activity and it has evolved. But technology, as we all know, is a catalyst for development throughout human history. I think it was Glenn mentioned the Manhattan Project, and I recently watched the movie Oppenheimer. And the dilemma with technology is that the human being uses the tool of technology for its needs. And technology is as useful or as dysfunctional as the human being decides that it should be. Technology by itself is dormant and its power is latent. And so we have to always ask ourselves if it is the technology that is the problem, or we humans in the use that we put technology to. But propaganda is a very natural human tendency, just as communication is a natural human tendency. The desire to influence other people's opinions and their behavior has always been with us. And those who go into politics in particular have that as a major activity, the desire to influence how the citizens, the population, think about issues that affect them. And what has happened over the years is that in the 1930s, there was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Goebbels. He was the Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment for Adolf Hitler. He was the first who said that radio would be for the 19th century what the print media was for the century before it. And he was right. And for our generation, AI and social media would be the determining technology for how we interact with each other, how we influence the behavior of one another. And it would depend on us to use it responsibly, and it would depend on us to fashion policies that allow the use of it to be beneficial. It's, as I said, it's a neutral tool. Yeah, you can have a Swiss knife in your kitchen and it would be the most efficient tool for a gourmet chef. It would also be a useful tool for a murderous spouse to get rid of his or her partner. It would depend on what use you decide to make of that knife. So I'd like to leave it there and just say that it's always important for the conversation to go on. And sometimes we focus a lot of our attention on the means, the tool, rather than those who use that tool. And society would be a much different place. It would be much better for itself if it uses AI as a tool positively, but it could also use it negatively. And why I mentioned the Manhattan Project is that Oppenheimer, who is called the father of the nuclear bomb, went through many conflicting emotions about whether or not this should be developed, because he wasn't quite sure whether humans had the maturity to handle what science and technology is able to provide. And so I think that we should think a lot about how we use this very important tool, which has the potential to enrich our lives, to make us better societies, and at the same time, it could destroy us. Thank you.
Thanks, Deshi. That brings us nicely to the question I want to ask Lavina. We talk about the attempts that are being made towards regulation and policy making and so on. But what is what are we regulating? I think that's a very fundamental question to ask.
Yeah, that's a good place for us to start. And I think it really boils down to the applications of technology. So initially, when it all came about, there was a large debate. What do we actually regulate? Do we regulate the people? Do we regulate the technology? Do we regulate, the applications? And if we look at the way that the structure has gone, the US had initially started with let's regulate the technology, but then they pivoted towards let's regulate the applications. Within the likes of the EU, they were always pro let's do it from an application perspective. And I think Africa is yet to make a grandstand in terms of which approach we would love to kind of follow. But given the sort of understanding of the landscape, the guess is that it probably is going to lean a lot towards the application more so than the actual technology, because the technology is far too inferior at this point in time, or immature, for us to regulate it, because we don't understand its full extent or full capacity. Therefore, regulating how it's applied to society, how it's applied to economics, or how it's applied politically, that makes a lot more sense. To give you an example, one of the largest fears that we have is obviously a lot of the big tech that is out there generates a lot more, revenue than most African countries. Right. Let's absorb that for a minute. If we look at the GDP of Africa, it sits at like 3 trillion. If we look at the the estimated amount that AI will contribute to any GDP globally, we sit at like ridiculous amounts, like 150 trillion. And if we had to take 1% of that, that's 1.5 trillion. That's half of Africa's GDP. Right. So like that's the knock-on effect that we need to start worrying a lot more around. And I think that's where the emphasis will go.
Will at the core of the policies you've seen so far, or the strategies that have been developed, is development at the core of, say, the AU strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen varied approaches to the development, but in essence, let's take, for example, talent, right? And talent in artificial intelligence. We may see some countries that really focus on, embedding education and talent into their core ecosystem. So, making sure universities are offering, multidisciplinary degrees or interdisciplinary degrees upfront, making sure that there's quick access to market in terms of upskilling, whereas others are really focused on, let's look at, those that are in the workplace and how can we then expedite that and how can we grow that talent. So I think development is always at the core, but it's, just each country kind of then comes across as different applications of it.
Thank you. Arthur, have you noticed any ethical dilemmas in your...
Well, especially with the advent of generative AI, there are massive ethical issues around using people's likenesses. But it goes back to the early days of using AI as a tool in areas like human resources, financial services being offered to people based on their profiles and the like. So if profiling is bad in law enforcement and financial services, AI has made it far worse when people aren't aware of the biases that AI can introduce. One of the examples in my book is when Amazon first started using AI as a recruitment and HR tool back in 2014. So we're talking about a decade ago, long before generative AI. And they trained their AI recruitment tool on existing CVs of successful recruits. So guess what? The vast majority of existing successful hires were pale males, and therefore the tool discriminated heavily, especially against women, because race was not a specific question or element of CVs in the United States, but gender was.